I'm going to try to do this without a microphone. Can you hear me, everybody?
Yeah.
I have a big, loud voice. I teach at the university, and I have to scream above students all the time. So, anyway, good morning, and I'm so glad you're here. I have a question to ask you guys to start this out. All right, think about this. What happened on May 7th, 1963, in Minneapolis that made theater history? Who knows? Well, what did Tyrone Guthrie do on that date? May 7th, 1963. What do you think?
Opening of the first play?
Opening of the first play. Who said that back there?
Mary.
Was anybody there? Does anybody remember it? Yeah, what do you remember, sir?
Well, I was small.
Of course.
Sure you were. But we heard about it, and we wanted to go to the Guthrie and see it. And so I went down there. I just remember there was quite a large audience at that time.
Right.
And Tyrone Guthrie came out and spoke.
On opening night?
Opening night.
Wow.
And he was a very tall man.
6'8".
Yeah. We were up in the middle section looking down. He looked tall in the middle section, and he spoke for a while about the theater, how it came to be.
Wonderful.
And it was a very short speech, but he did talk about that.
Well, the play was very long, so I'm sure you...
Oh yeah, we weren't quite prepared for that.
Well, I'll tell you about that. So opening night, there was international press there, national press. It was kind of scary. I mean, the actors were nervous, and Guthrie himself, I'm sure, was nervous. He really couldn't even watch the play. He paced in the lobby because he was just, so nervous. And he realized about halfway through that Hamlet might not have been the right choice. Because it was so long. And the crowd that was there that night, if you might remember, they were kind of there for, an event. They're all bejeweled and gorgeous. And so they were doing a lot of shifting in their seats. He was smart. I mean, he was an international director, so he knew what was what. He thought maybe it would have been better to open with a light summer musical or something. I don't know. But Hamlet, he was a classical director, so, he wanted to put on Shakespeare. So anyway, well, thank you for that. And by the way, I'd love interaction with you guys. If any of you have any Guthrie memories you want to share, just let me know. Just touch it. Oh, okay. All right. So, yeah, the Minnesota, do you guys need chairs back there? No? Are you sure? Well, all right. So, now anyway, this theater actually was very different. From the beginning, this theater had excellent staff, had outside funding. It had a $2.3 million theater. I mean, who starts with that, right? It had community support, and it had lots of money, and it had a very famous founder. Tyrone Guthrie was born in Ireland in 1900, and by 1959, he was a world famous director. He was a big time director. He'd been on Broadway, and he had some problems with Broadway. He had some failures on Broadway, and he just hated Broadway. And he thought it was too, you had to have a play that was successful overnight or it closed, and money, and pressure. And so, at all box office. So he decided to do something about this. And what he decided to do was to establish a theater out in the boondocks of America, far away from Broadway. And so he and two of his friends, let's see here just a moment. And here he is. Like the gentleman said, he was 6'8". He was a very imposing figure. He was very loud. He was very British. He was just kind of an exciting person to be around. So after his experience on Broadway, he decided to, like I said, establish a theater out in the middle of America, if he could find someplace. if they would have him. So he and two of his friends and associates, this was Peter Zeisler and Oliver Ray, decided on a plan. This was to build a repertory theater with a resident stable company of actors, the best technicians and designers they could get, inclined to do the classics with an open thrust stage and with an auditorium that went 3/4 of the way around. That open thrust stage was very important to him. This theater would be concerned with artistic growth and progress and not so crippled by the tyranny of commercial success. And of course, it would be as far from Broadway as he could get it. So what did they do? Does anybody know? I know, kind of interesting. They put an ad in the New York Times in September of 1959, and they just said, anybody want us? We'll build a theater wherever you want. So he thought he would get hundreds of replies, right? And what a big deal. He was Tyrone Guthrie, right? But guess how many he got? Oh, he got 7. He was a little disappointed because he thought his secretary would be knee deep in paper, letters begging him to come. Well, anyway, he narrowed that down to 3. I think it was Milwaukee, Detroit, and Minneapolis. Minneapolis was chosen because, well, he liked Minneapolis for one thing. And it was chosen because the Walker Foundation gave $400,000 to him, just gave it, and that land behind the Walker Art Center, just gave it to it. The Ford Foundation insured the theater for 3 seasons against loss. I mean, we're really racking up the good stuff here, right? The movers and shakers of Minneapolis, like John Coles of the Tribune family, he supported him. And let's see here. This is Doc Whiting. If anybody, you guys are familiar with the University of Minnesota Theater Department, he was very excited about this and was very encouraging to Guthrie. So, and he also thought, I'm sure, that they could make a liaison between the Guthrie and his students. So, of course, he was very excited about this. So, and then the community was very excited. Do any of you remember what kind of furor this created when he came to town? Anybody know about that? Well, you do, sir, right? You remember how exciting it was?
Oh, yeah.
And money was raised, there was donations pouring in, there were parties that were fundraisers. I mean, it was a big deal. And then there was a group of volunteers called the Stagehands that did all this work for free for this theater to make it a reality. And they did it happily. They were excited about it. And Guthrie freely admitted he wanted to be a big fish in a little pond. And so guess what the little pond was? Minneapolis, right? So then, of course, they had to build the theater. And here he is in the half-built theater. Now, they hired an architect by the name of Ralph Rapson. The Guthrie team really didn't hire him. He was sort of foisted on them, and they had a lot of problems with each other. There was lots of bickering back and forth. Tanya Mazejevich, who was Guthrie's design partner, she locked horns with Rapson quite a bit. Rapson was kind of a curt person and said kind of things that were not very nice, and so there was a lot of problems. But, the theater got built. I'm sure if any of you have built a house, you know that there's all sorts of problems with builders, right? And architects. So, does anyone in here remember what happened to the seat debacle? Don't you, Stephen? Don't you remember?
I know that he chose the multicolored seats so that if the house wasn't full, the actors wouldn't see a big swath of, one color that would be empty, and it would
Right.
look in the glare of the lights like people were there.
You guys remember the old Guthrie, those multicolored seats? Well, Ralph Rapson chose those without consulting the Guthrie team. And they arrived, and that was the thing. He wanted, if the theater was empty, he wanted it to look like it was full. I mean, I don't know if that was true or not, but that's what he thought. Anyway, the Guthrie team wanted some subdued colors. They wanted blues and grays or something. So when these seats arrived, they were appalled, but there was nothing they could do about it because it was too expensive to send them back. And they were already having budget problems. I mean, 20 feet had to be cut off the theater, and that was kind of hurt the backstage area and some of the offices back there. And so it was already budgetary problems, so they couldn't be extravagant and send those seats back, although they wanted to, of course. Now, Guthrie was a vibrant, innovative director, very much focused on the actor and the open stage. On this kind of arrangement, what the actor wears would be closely scrutinized. I mean, you can imagine how close that audience is to that actor. And you could see the buttons and the seams and the zippers, and you could see everything. It's not like a proscenium stage where they're so far away. So, and you know, the seat that was furthest from the Guthrie middle of the stage was only 55 feet. I mean, that was a great design, I think, anyway. The idea was that the audience and the actors breathe the same air, of course, not like the proscenium. Guthrie did not like the proscenium stage. You guys know what I mean by proscenium, right? And he didn't like that proscenium stage because it was too much of a distance between the actor and the audience. It's just created this gulf, of course. So he was not a big fan. He loved his thrust stage, of course. Now, the Guthrie costume designers, by the way, I interviewed 11 of the original designers, and that was great because they were so smart. And these were world-class designers. I don't know why they talked to me, but they did. God bless them. And I had a wonderful time with them because they were so full of knowledge. They were kind. They were really anxious to talk. You know what it is? People want to talk about themselves, right? Even if they're famous designers. And so, they talked my ear off, and it was great. I loved it. And they all had different opinions about things, of course, but one thing they agreed on was that costume shop at this new theater was the highest of standards. And that was because a woman by the name of Annette Garceau was the costumier. I don't know if any of you remember her at all. But she came with the Guthrie team, and she had been in London. She'd been up at Stratford. Guthrie and Tanya Mazevich had established a theater up in Stratford, Ontario, to do Shakespeare, and she had been a part of that. I met her, interviewed her. She was a formidable force, this woman. She didn't put up with any nonsense in that costume shop. I mean, if you didn't know what you were doing, you were out. And it was complicated. It's complicated to make a costume. To take a flat piece of fabric and put it around something and make it round, it's very, very difficult. She was tiny, but she was tough. Now, the Guthrie designers that I spoke with did discuss the importance of that three-dimensional sculptural costume on a thrust stage. Very important. On a proscenium stage, often the costume is kind of two-dimensional, but on that thrust stage, it's statuesque. I mean, you can see it from all sides. And you guys know, you've gone to the play at the Guthrie, you know how those actors have to turn constantly because this part of the audience wants to look at them and this part of the audience wants. So that costume has to be seen all sides. And in the beginning years, the costume sort of took the place of scenery because Guthrie didn't want scenery at the beginning. They just had these panels at the back of the stage. Does anybody remember those? Do you remember those? They had those panels on wheels that kind of substituted for the sets. Now remember also that when you looked at a Guthrie costume, you could look across and see your neighbor and your aunt and your grandma and all, because you look across the stage into the audience. So that has to be taken into consideration when you're designing. Also, 3/4 of the audience looked down on that stage, which meant the floor of the stage was the background. And if the floor was just that oak floor they had, well, whatever. If they put a covering on it, well, that was fine too. But what I'm trying to say is that you had to take into consideration that floor, and you had, when you design the costumes. In other words, one of my costume designer interviewees said, "Oh, I just do pastels and greens when I do that, when I do the Guthrie, because of that brown floor." That's what she felt she had to do. Now, designing at this theater had a lot of advantages, according to my interviewees. There seemed to be more time. There was a slower pace. You could experiment more, not like those frantic times in New York. The Guthrie designer always knew exactly the kind of stage they were designing for. The director was right there. The set designer was right there if there was a set. The lighting designer was right there. It could all be consulted. The actor was right there, and you could get a fitting anytime you want. Now, just think what it was like in New York. You probably had 1 or 2 fittings with the actor. The Guthrie, you just talked to the stage manager, and you got that actor to come in. So those costumes probably fit a lot better, those Guthrie costumes. And then there was a stock. I don't know if you guys know what a costume stock means. That it's just full of costumes from former plays. And in the beginning, there wasn't anything because they hadn't got any plays. But later on, there was stock, and so you could choose stuff from the stock, and you didn't have to make every single costume. By the way, even places like the Guthrie don't make every single costume. It's too expensive. And they often pull from stock or buy from secondhand stores or from stores or get the actors to bring their own clothes or whatever. You don't have to make every single costume. Although you think a place like the Guthrie, oh, you know, they make every costume, but they don't. And then also another great advantage was that you could go to a rehearsal anytime you felt like it, which meant you could be sitting in there at that rehearsal and go, uh-oh, that costume, it's not going to work because the actor is hanging by their toenails or something, and the costume's not going to work. So you can change it. It's much more convenient than New York. You'd have to run around to the costume shop and then run somewhere else to get fabric. So it was a very, very in-house, very convenient type of place. It was quite lovely, and in that respect. Any questions so far?
Where did they source their fabrics from?
Fabrics, that's a good. Well, here we go. We're in Minneapolis, right? We're in St. Paul. We have Minnesota Fabrics. And we had that place called Amlickson's that was kind of fancy schmancy, you know,
We
fabric.
had Teeners.
And Teeners, of course.
Down.
Yeah, so we had some places, but what they usually did at the Guthrie was go to New York. They just put the outlay, the expense, and they went to New York because the selection was so much better, obviously. And those places in New York catered to these costume designers, so they would have all this lovely fabric to show them. So, speaking of fabric, one of my designers, Jack Edwards, said that before he did anything, before he read after he read the play, but before he talked to the director and got concepts and stuff, he went shopping for fabric because that would inspire him to design the costumes. Besides which, he knew that the fabric was there then, so he, didn't have to flail around for fabric. Now, a costume is all about communication, of course. When the actor walks out on the stage, it's just like when you walk in a room, everybody looks at your clothes and goes, aha. So it's all about communication. It's even heightened on a stage, of course. Jack Edwards, by the way, he was so fun to talk to, said about costume design, I say, when an actor comes through a door, you should know everything a playwright wants you to know about them, down to what they had for breakfast, if that's important, where they went to school, how much money they had, what kind of background they have, any of those things. On stage, it's gotta be there. And you've got your point of focus. So you're designing costumes, you really have to get into that character and try to figure out their background, what would make them wear what they're wearing, because the audience needs to know that. One of my designers, Tanya Mazejevich, she was like I said, she was the co-designer of the theater with Guthrie. She told me that, yes, you need to communicate all of those things, but you don't want to dot every I and cross every T for the audience. You want to leave something to the imagination. So there's different ways of looking at it, of course.
Would the designer then interact with the actor?
Here's the deal with the actor. So, when you design costumes, you read the play first, right? You really read it. One of my designers says he reads the play 20 times to get that juice going, Then you meet with the director because you don't want to form your ideas before you meet with the director. Because what if you think, oh, I want to do it in outer space or something, And the director said, no, we're doing it in Elizabethan. And so your ideas are all, because you got to go along with the director. He's the person or she's the person that sets the concept. And so then you do your research and your fabric shopping, then you do your preliminary drawings, then you show the director, and then the director says yes or no, I hate everything, or I love everything. And then you do your final renderings. Now, when you do your final renderings, you need to show the actor the final renderings, because the actor can often get ideas about their characterization, because of course they're going to say, oh, yeah, that's the way I'm supposed to look, right? So it's very important that you interact. And then one of my designers talked about that first fitting with the actor, how important that is. The actor has a responsibility too. The actor has to put aside their vanity and put aside their personal idea of how they're supposed to look. Because I'm a costume designer, and I've heard actors, the first fitting, go, oh, this doesn't look good on me. And I don't, well, you know, you've done all the research. You know what the overall picture of the play is supposed to look like. So you've got to get that actor to go along with what you want. I mean, actors have their own opinions, of course. And a thing that the costume does for the actor, really, is to take a lot of responsibility off of the actor. In other words, when they walk out on stage, there's already all sorts of communication going on that they don't have to expose, because, you know, the costume's done it for you. You know, you're either your class, how poor you are, if you're old, if you're young, I mean, all those things, are the burden's taken off. Of course, makeup and hair too, of course, but still, the costume is very important. Now, this is that lovely Tanya Mazejevich. She's world famous, actually, costume designer. She's she's deceased now, but she designed costumes all over the world. She stayed in Minneapolis for 3 years to baby the Guthrie lawn, and so did Guthrie, which was very nice of them, right? And so she right here is making chainmail. She's got that chainmail collar on her, and I'll tell you later on how that's made. She's pounding string that has been knitted, painted gray or silver, and then pound it with that mallet with that cloth on it, and it makes it look like chainmail. And then, of course, the actor doesn't have to wear real chainmail, which who'd want to do that? That would be horrible. Look, actors suffer enough with their costumes, right? I mean, I'm sure you've been to plays and seen some big hunky thing on an actor and go, oh, the poor thing. But, you know, you suffer in silence, of course. That's what everyone tells you when you're an actor. You just suffer in silence. You just, you know, I'm sorry if it's hot. Too bad. This is the opening night tickets. Now, this is that invitation that you got from the Guthrie, if you were probably kind of a donor or something. And like I said, that was a heavy-duty night. That was something else. Guthrie talks about it in his book, A New Theater, and it's very funny the way he talks about it. Okay, so here we are. Let's go into Hamlet. And I was lucky enough, to go down. The IDS Center, when I was doing this dissertation, believe it or not, had a big display of Guthrie costumes on real people. So I was able to get my little camera and go down there and take pictures in real light, in natural light, of these costumes from the first 10 years. I mean, how lucky was that? Here is the rendering. Now, that rendering, of course, is for this costume. This is a Gertrude costume, and it's called, let's see, what is it called? Oyster Satin, I think it's called. This is damask right here, and so is the cape. And it was a very beautiful costume, and of course it was made wonderfully because it was made at the Guthrie costume shop. This is Ophelia. This is her court dress, and it has embroidery on it. That's the rendering. This is Tanya Mazejevich, by the way. Here is more Guthrie costumes. Look at this dress that we just looked at. Look how it pools on the floor. That was on purpose, but again, think how tough that was to walk in. She had to walk and act at the same time, right? So I'm sure it was very difficult. This was Jessica Tandy, by the way. Guthrie didn't want stars at his theater at all. He, you know, bad Broadway, right? So the only stars really were Jessica Tandy and Hume Cronin, and they didn't act like stars. They were, because a repertory theater, you're the star one night, and the next night you're the servant or something. So that's what they did. So that they were on board with that. Right here is a soldier in a breastplate and a red tunic and a plumed hat and those high boots. So that was, and this was done in modern dress, and it caused a lot of controversy, but it really wasn't modern. It was more just, they had trousers on, and it wasn't ye old doublets and ye old tights and ye old corsets and all that sort of thing. It was really kind of an enhanced Edwardian look. But there was a lot of controversy. Now, Guthrie and Mozevich kind of patronizingly thought that American audiences would get it better if it was modern, modern costumes, which was a little patronizing. I mean, come on, we've been watching Westerns for years, right? We know about those period costumes. So, anyway, so yeah, it was an enhanced Edwardian look. And here's more Guthrie costumes. Now, this guy right here was the player king. If you know the play Hamlet, you know there's a play within a play. And the players had these medieval costumes on, not modern at all. So that was a little bit different. And here is Jessica Tandy in her fainting away because of the horrible events of the play, and her ladies in waiting. And she's got this, red velvet dress on. It was just pretty much standard. This is the Miser. This is based on the Commedia dell'arte. Do you guys know what that is? It was a traveling troupe in medieval times that had stock characters like the old man and the young lovers and all that. Here is the Hume Cronin character. His name was Harpagon. He was a miser, so his clothes were raggedy and tattered. Here is Frosine. She is a matchmaker, and this fabric right here was painted at the Guthrie because they couldn't find what they wanted, and that often happened at this theater. When they couldn't find the fabric they wanted, they just silk screened it or painted it or whatever. Here's some renderings of Marianne. She was the young lover. Cléante, the other young lover. Here's a servant, and here is Marianne and Cléante in these costumes right here. And then this is Mozevich. A lot of this is going to be Mozevich because she just, like I said, was there for 3 years. But they used other designers. That's another thing that Guthrie was good at, bringing in new designers so that, you wouldn't get stale doing same designer all the time. These servants back here have masks on, and that was also a commedia type of device. Here's a mask that was made at the Guthrie. Half mask so that you could talk. Here is this character named Valère, and he was not all duded up in all those laces and ribbons because he was a poor person, so of course he didn't have all the ribbons. Here's Elise in a silk dress with lace trim. Now, Tanya Mozevich told me that when I interviewed her that they based a lot of their design thoughts on this Picasso painting here called The Three Musicians, and costume designers often did that. They often picked a painting and based their thoughts upon that painting. This is The Three Sisters. This was a play written for the proscenium, so Guthrie was a little nervous about putting it on, but it was the most popular play of the season. Now, this costume rendering right here, also Mozevich, this was the sister-in-law that everybody hated, and she was put into a garish costume with a green type of, oops, I'll just wait till that's, with a green type of sash on it, and that was to show her garish, her poor taste. The Three Sisters, of course, had great taste, and they dressed very conservatively. This is the young sister. She's in white, and that is a costume designer device, is to put one character in a color that's way different from everybody else. Irina was still young and hopeful. If you know the story of the Three Sisters, they're all thinking they're going to go to Moscow, and they never get there. And so the young sister really thinks she is going, and she's in white to show that. And here is another Natasha costume, that sister-in-law that nobody liked. So kind of look at, she's kind of frills and all this sort of thing. Poor taste, poor taste. Death of a Salesman, they kind of run out of money by Death of a Salesman. Well, that's a good thing, because it hardly needed any costumes. They used costumes from the actors' own closets, believe it or not. And, but they bought a few things. But they had to buy them at secondhand stores because they wanted that sag into them, because these characters were kind of lower class, poor, and they didn't have great clothes. So that was very valid. Okay, here's Henry V. This soldier right here, see all this stuff right in here? This is industrial felt that has been painted and rubbed with graphite to make it look like armor, so that the poor actor doesn't have to wear real armor. But the industrial felt's probably hot, as you know. Here's that chainmail, that whole chainmail business. Now, the costumes for this play, of course, were, they were swashbuckling. They were very colorful. These costumes, by the way, were made at a studio in New York. The Guthrie did send their costumes out to be made sometimes when they couldn't handle it all. This was a very famous studio in New York called Ray Diffin. I don't know if any of you ever heard of Ray Diffin, but he was very well known for his beautiful work on costumes. Then they were sent back to the Guthrie so that Louis Brown, the designer, could paint them and do whatever he needed to do to make them fit. So here you see all these velvets and furs and velveteens and all that sort of thing. Here is Henry in a velveteen doublet, very beautiful. And here is Catherine in a silk dress with a raw silk cape. Now, this device up here is kind of interesting to me because I don't think that was ever seen in the 15th century. I think this was the 1960s and they just did, because it looks 60s to me, doesn't it to you?
Yeah.
You got to guard against that when you're designing costumes. You don't want to put whatever century you're in into the costumes. It's a temptation, of course, but kind of don't want to do that. I'm not criticizing Louis Brown at all. Who am I to criticize? But I'm just saying. Louis Brown, by the way, was my favorite interviewee. He was a curmudgeon. He was grouchy. He didn't think costume design was a fit job for a grown man, he told me. It's just being a lady's maid. But he kept designing, and he did beautiful, beautiful work. He didn't like the Guthrie. He didn't like the interior. He thought it was old men's club, he called it, and ugly, he said. He didn't like the acoustics in the theater. He said you couldn't hear anything. He was just kind of grumpy the whole time that we did that interview, but I liked him because he was so honest. He was brutally honest. And he didn't romanticize costume design, like I said. He didn't. No. Here's Henry V and all of that battle scenes and all. It was very colorful. It was well done. They had to take a few costumes from Miser. They were already recycling costumes because Henry V was so huge, and they obviously just couldn't afford to make new costumes for everybody. By the way, Louis Brown was upset that they had to use those costumes from the Miser, but oh well. This is St. Joan. This is what they call 15th century style simplified. It was, and you can see the Dauphin here. Now, he was a despicable character, so his, and this was Tanya Mazevich, by the way, his gown was saggy and old looking, and this is kind of molting fur around his neck. This was a character statement, big time here, about what a morally bankrupt character this guy was. This is Joan. She's not in that felt armor at all. She's in celastic armor. And that was because she had to wear it so much, and she had to move around, had to be lightweight. I mean, St. Joan, right? St. Joan, parishioners. St. Joan was in armor almost through the whole play, so she had to wear some kind. This is a tabard right here, and this has all this stuff on here is felt that has been glued on. So that probably was very difficult to wash, and I'm sure they didn't do it very often. Here's Volpone. I don't know if you guys know about Volpone, but this is also despicable characters. This is low-life characters. who do horrible things to each other. So they're named after animals. This is Volpone means fox. This is Mosca, the fly, and this is a soldier. And this was silkscreen, and you can see that foxy fur right here. Pretty obvious what he is. And that orange wig he had on. Mosca was in iridescent colors to look like a fly. There was a raven in black hues. There were beaks for noses, great feathered collars to preen and puff, clawed gloves, and a hawk's chest. And this was also supervised again by Ray Diffin, because the Guthrie just couldn't handle all these costumes. I mean, they just couldn't. It was expensive to send it to Ray Diffin's, but you know, they had enough money at the beginning of the seasons. They always had plenty of money. This right here, this is Celia. This was one of those costumes I got to photograph down at the IDS. Now, this is a big character statement here because she's one of the sweet characters in this play. Very few of them. And she had on blue. And what do you think blue indicated?
Virginity.
Purity. Well, and then what did the pearls indicate? Virginity, right? So here she is with pearls and that blue dress, so that she was sweet and pure and virginal, which was an anachronism in this play because everybody was a crumb. So now here's another deal where they based it on Titian, the painter, the Renaissance painter, and you can see, look at his heavy brocade and his big fur collar. So they use this as an inspiration. Okay, here's Richard III. This was the biggest play they did during the 10 years. This was super big with tons of people in it. Richard III is also a despicable character. Now, Lewis Brown loved doing this because he liked doing plays that were despicable. So he wanted to create a sense of obscenity. He tried to make strange and sick colors. Black was dominant, there was grays, and it was based on Eisenstein's film, Ivan the Terrible. Did any of you know that film? It's very violent and very dark and very grim. So they used a film this time. They used a lot of the Henry V costumes, of course, because it was so huge. They couldn't possibly make all of it. This robe right here on Richard was a kind of a sick turquoise color, and it was so big that they had to take it out on the stage and cut it out because it was just too big. So, and then this is a kind of a grayish, of course, gown. There were no nice colors in this play, really. And then that big, huge 15th century headdress. This thing's amazing. I mean, these things are hard to make, but of course it was the Guthrie costume shop, and they could do it. This play was also based on Francis Bacon. Does anybody know this painter? He's kind of a very sick painter with very sick images. So it was based on him. I mean, you can see this is kind of icky, gross. And here's that wonderful chainmail, up close vision of it. And it was great. It worked great. The Way of the World was very light and frothy, and it was based on bouquets of flowers, and it was beautiful, bright colors, and it was all about tassels and fringes and big wigs and high heels, and it was based on period. The designer, Tanya Mazevich, found period renderings of bouquets of flowers, and that's what she based it on. And this is her rendering right here. Cherry Archer. Well, this was a big switch. This was nice and lightweight with light wools and laces and chiffons. And so this was Russia, of course, rural Russia. This was also Tanya Mazevich. And this suit right here, the Guthrie did not have, they were not organized to make suits. So for many years, they rented suits from Western Costume Company in LA. And that's just what they had to do. Tailoring is so difficult. It takes up so much time. They just didn't have the time to do it. This is the Caucasian chalk circle. This is Lewis Brown again. And he only had $2,000. This was low budget. And so what he did was, and he loved doing this, he would go to Goodwill and Salvation Army, and he would buy blankets and sheets and tablecloths and make the costumes out of those things, because he wanted that texture and he wanted that sag. And so he was happy to do that. He said he haunted Goodwill and Salvation Army for weeks. He was there, almost every day. Here's a example of that sagging that went on, and this is a distressed costume. Often, a designer will buy a costume and then do what they call distressing it, which means putting a cheese grater on it, or dyeing it, or bleaching it, or stomping on it, or whatever, to make it have that lived-in look. This guy right here, the soothsayer, he has a fur hat on, and he has a cape on with the fur on the inside. Louis Brown cut up a fur coat for this, by the way, an old fur coat. I mean, who could afford real fur, right? And geez, that would have cost $1 jillion. So, and it was a play within a play, and some of the costumes in the play within the play were, somebody needed armor, so they flattened out tin cans and strung them together. But he made do, and by the way, this is one of the most popular plays in that first 10 years. So it just goes to prove you don't have to have lots of money to make a popular play. Oops. This was just some programs I wanted to show you from those first 10 years. Look how 60s looking they are, right? So that's just what I wanted to show you there. This was As You Like It. This was set in the Civil War period, believe it or not. This caused some controversy, but everybody accepted it, and it looked pretty good. This was A Dance of Death. This is another Louis Brown special. He loved this play because it's so grim and so gloomy, and he just thought it was his best work. He told me it was his best work, and it probably was. It was based on the painter Edvard Munch. Do you guys know that painter? Strindberg, the author, and Munch were good friends, so this made sense. There is a strange hysteria in this play, awareness of the isolation of each human being, and the torment of the boredom of the familiar. This rendering by Louis Brown, you can see where he got inspired right here. This is a sick, kind of olive drab color. He batiqued. This is batik right here with an overlay over it. And he batiqued a lot of the fabric. Batiking is, it's kind of a lost wax method. And it made he wanted to make fabric that was off kilter and upsetting because of this play, of the theme of this play. This is Skin of Our Teeth. The audience assembled to take part in a game of make-believe. This play concerns man's survival throughout the ages in the face of disastrous setbacks. Sounds like our present time, doesn't it? It was fanciful and charming, and it spans the entire history of humanity, which means there were no real periods in it, because it was everything. There was a dinosaur and a mammoth elephant. These were people inside these, of course. Think how hot that was. And that were steel cages with felt, nubby felt on top of them. And you can see them right here, the mammoth and the dinosaur. The costume renderings were by Carolyn Parker and Tanya Mazejevich, and they were done in crayon on purpose to give that feeling of fun and fanciful to it. Let's see. Here's a bigger picture of what you were just looking at. This is a knit bathing suit, of course, from the turn of the century. And like I said, this actress right here wore a lot of different costumes because she was kind of the theme that ran through. So she wore costumes from all the periods that the play covered. This was also based on a Paul Klee painting called Table of Color in Gray Major. The colors they used were from this painting. Doctor's Dilemma, Louis Brown made these costumes for this actress. He told me he liked her, and I don't know what that meant, and that maybe he just liked her, And he made very high couturier clothing for her, even though he said you could wear it out on the streets. This was set in the 1890s, but this was a Shaw play, but This character didn't wear a corset because she was a free spirit, so he based the costume designs around all that. This is Shoemaker's Holiday. A new designer was in. His name was Dhal Delu. Do you guys ever watch Cheers? He did the set for Cheers. So, and I think that set's in the Smithsonian. So, good for Dhal Delu. He was great to interview. He was so nice. And he said he cut his teeth at the Guthrie, and they gave him a lot of opportunities. This is that felt business again, but it's leatherized this time, not made into armor. And there were poor people in this play, shoemakers. He wanted to present the shoemakers as their clothing they would make out of canvas and leather because they were shoemakers. They didn't have any money for this play, so he had to go up to Stratford to get costumes up there. Now, this was a dilemma for him because he had to do the renderings and hope that he could find costumes that looked like the rendering. So this is a bit of a dilemma. They made 13 of the costumes, but most of them were pulled. This guy right here, I think he probably was pulled. This is a upper class guy in this play, so he had all these nice clothes on, of course. He didn't have the poor people's clothes on, he had the rich people's clothes on. And here this is the cast. You can see there were a lot of cast members, so there's a lot of costumes. This is Harper's Ferry. This was set in 1859, right before the Civil War. And they didn't have a lot of money for this one either. This is a Lewis Brown special. He called it an appalling play. He said, I looked at those costume renderings 2 years later and I was appalled. So, Lewis Brown, it was great. These costumes were all bought from secondhand stores because men's fashions don't change that much. So they could just be bought in 1964, whenever they were bought, and distressed, and that worked out fine. And they didn't have to make anything for this. They just bought everything. It was based on George Caleb Bingham, who was an 1850s painter. Lewis Brown said that George Caleb Bingham's paintings were so clear you could cut costumes right from looking at them. And he was an inspiration for this, of course. Now, this is the House of Atreus. Does anybody remember this? Do you? What do you remember about it?
Big characters, big overflowing, massive.
Yes, huge. This was a year in the making. They experimented and tossed things away and experimented and kept things. Now, there were 3 levels of characters in this play. There were nurses, there were servants, there was the chorus, and they were normal-sized humans. Then there was the heroic figures like Clytemnestra and Cassandra. Then there were the gods, and those, like you said, those were the big ones. And what they did was, see this draping right in here? This is chicken wire underneath here. So they bought hundreds of yards of homespun fabric of different weaves and weights. They dipped it in latex with water in it. They put that dripping upon these chicken wire frames, and then it hardened. They had a door in the back of this so that the poor little actor could by the way, men played all these roles, and not to be sexist, it wasn't that at all. It was just that these costumes were brutal, and women probably were not able to handle it. So they had a door in back of here where the actor got in and sat on a seat. This is the rendering for this costume. This is Athena, and here she is in production. So it was, and Tanya Mazejevich was a designer, and she went around with pictures of erosion, like eroded columns and Greek columns and that sort of thing, and to show the people who were making these costumes, because they weren't just dipped in glue, they were spattered with paint, and all sorts of things was done to them. This was a big deal. This show was the Guthrie's, the big one. These are masks. I was able to photograph this down at the government center, had a display of costumes, so I was able to get down there. These are the normal characters right here. These masks were made, this is Carolyn Parker making a mask, and it's clay, and then paper mache was put on. So these are all paper mache masks right here. You can see this one's sort of still in the making right here. Here's someone spattering those costumes. And here, boots are called cothernae. They're from Greek plays, and the poor actors, if they didn't have enough to worry about, had to put these boots on. One of them was 18 inches high, and they had to walk in those costumes, those masks, and these boots. And Tanya Mazevich told me, she said, she said, I knew that there were going to be some problems, that people were not going to wear them, or they were going to laugh at them, or she said everyone was perfectly professional about it and just bore the pain that they caused. The masks, by the way, were put on with football helmets and straps to stabilize them, of course. But those cool third eye, these were just athletic boots that this rubber was put on the bottom of them. I just saw somebody today come in here with sandals that were so high they looked like third eye. Didn't you see? They were very thick. Oh, and these were the Furies. Now, these are the most inhuman looking ones of all. They got to make these before they even started production on this, because they could make one size fits all. And these were those scary, the Furies that would, House of Atreus is a revenge play. It's the Greeks, and the Furies would come to torment poor humans, so they had to be as ugly and awful looking as they could possibly look. Now here's some more of those masks. I got to photograph this in natural light. Here is Apollo, and here is his mask, and here's Carolyn Parker putting the mask on Apollo. You can see that the lower part of his face has that gold makeup on because that was exposed, so at least they got to. Here is another mask, the Athena mask, and you can see that how they just corroded everything and made it dense and come out, and it was a very, very interesting type of costume design. Here is Hermes. Do you remember any of these gods in particular? Do you remember Athena, maybe? Or Apollo? Okay, all right. But anyway, it was a huge, big deal. Now, I just want to tell you something about this play. It was on that Guthrie stage, of course, and then it went to New York, and it was on a proscenium stage, and it got terrible reviews. Do you know why? It wasn't meant for a proscenium stage. It was meant for that big, hunky costume to be moving out amongst the audience. Behind the proscenium, it looked funny, and the critic that I read made fun of it, said, who needs this? This looks ridiculous. But here in Minneapolis, on the thrust stage, it was a big deal, and it
I
was...
saw a production of the House of Atreus in an outdoor Greek theater in Southern California. I want to say in the mid-60s, and it was outdoors during sunlight with huge, big, and I wonder if they borrowed pieces from this. I was 10.
Think about costume storage. Think how difficult this was. Maybe they did. I know these costumes traveled because they went to New York and got that bad review. So it very, very well could be. Here is the House of Atreus. Look, it was more of a ritual than a play. It really, it was just this massive production. Okay, so here's The Visit. This is a play about another despicable character. She comes to town and wants somebody to murder somebody in the town, and the townspeople say no until she starts dangling a bunch of money in front of them, and then they go, well, maybe. So anyway, here's the character. She had a dress on that was hand-painted, and the inseam, I don't even know if I should tell you this, but anyway, the inseam had a red panel in it. These were culottes, so that when she sat down, you could see that I was creepy, but these costumes were creepy, and the characters were creepy. Now, the designer went to Carnaby Street in London, and he bought a bunch of costumes for the people when they had been paid the money, they'd done the deed, been paid the money, and they were able to buy, fashionable clothing. This is all very 60s. And these costumes were very kind of creepy looking too. It was creepy show. One's supposed to be pretty, one's supposed to be pretty. Here we have an Elizabethan Shakespeare at last. And it was completely Elizabethan. This was all upholstery fabric and heavy velvets, and So it was very Elizabethan. One of the reviewers said, finally, we get Elizabethan. We're not trying to make a point with some kind of... Anyway, he said, this critic said, it was a return to orthodox but by no means uninventive Shakespeare staging, with no attempt to updating or undating it and linking it to the sexual revolution or whatever. Nicholas Hilliard was the painter that they based it on. Very strictly Elizabethan. Very, didn't deviate. Here's Sergeant Musgrave's Dance. Now, this play was about townspeople who were mired in sort of a very sooty, very dirty thing, dirty atmosphere. And these soldiers come to town and they save the day. And they have all these bright costumes on. Now, the townspeople were all in grays and browns and dirty whites. And the soldiers, by contrast, of course, were all spiffy looking and wonderful with nice high boots on. And so that was a design thing, obviously, using color to separate. And do you see what this is right in here? Do you guys know what cartridge pleating is? Anybody?
Sure.
It's a way to get a ton of fabric into a small space. And it's taking the fabric and going up and down, up and down, up and down, crushing it together, sewing it, and then sewing it like a hinge onto the waistband. And her skirt obviously has an immense amount of fabric in it. And I think the costume designer wanted to do that because it was heavy. He wanted everybody in the town to look heavy and worn out. Sergeant Musgrave's Dance, by the way, was the first time they took those screens away completely. They thought they were going to hurt Tanya Mazejevich's feelings because she designed them. But she was happy. She didn't care. And so they used sets. They started doing full sets. This play was based on L.S. Lowry, The Cripples, and the pants legs and the boots are very heavy. And that's what the costumes were like. The bottom of the pants legs were very heavy and thick, and it put everybody in the town in boots to give them that earthbound feel to them. This was a master builder. This is just pure representational costuming. Nothing that any kind of undertones to it. 1890s. This was a resistible rise of Arturo Ui. This was about the rise of Hitler, and it was based in Chicago in the 1930s. And it had those suits, those pinstripe suits with those big lapels. It was just pretty straightforward. Merton of the Movies was strange. Do you see how painterly all of this is in here? Well, the designer, Fred Vopel, did his renderings like that, and the director said, I want the costumes to have that painting on them. And so it was kind of an unusual approach. This was about kind of a hayseed that goes to Hollywood and wants to get in the movies, and so there were different levels. There were the people who worked on the movies. There was the big star, these are the clothes. And the costumes were pink. Now, can you see those obvious pinstripes? And then can you see the painting right here? These costumes were heavily painted. And often costumes are painted, but not quite to this extent. It didn't quite work, to tell you the real truth. The critics weren't too thrilled with this. But anyway, this is one of the stars' costumes. This was down at the IDS that I got to take a picture of that, and I was very happy about that. This is Julius Caesar. The Guthrie had a thing about not putting those Roman and Greek plays into togas. Can anybody tell me why they think? What do you think? What about togas? There's no character delineation. You can't tell one from the other, right? So what they did for this one is they went way out on a limb. This is Julius Caesar, of course, Shakespeare. And they went into South America, of all places. They used Mayan, Aztec, and animal worship motifs. The senators were all in European cutaways. The military men were evolved European military line and cut. The plebeians were in the native dress. So here you see a plebeian in native dress. Here again is a Lupercal dancer. And you see the military man. This is Brutus, and he's in twill and his lace applique on here. So, and then this is a mask that had felt mosaics on it with glue over it. And here we have Calpurnia. She's in a, let's see, what was she? Crepe dress with an overlay of pieced antique lace. And here we have some of the South American type characters. This is Carrie Fishbane Robbins. She didn't do too much at the Guthrie, but I went to New York to interview her, and she was so interesting. And here's that Lupercal dancer. So, what do you think? Do you think critics like this or not?
No.
No. They didn't. There was a lot of kind of semi-nudity in it, and some people didn't like that, of course. And so, yes.
Are all these costumes still in existence? Could they put on Julius Caesar again?
Well, the Guthrie had Guthrie rental for years. They don't. COVID put the kibosh on that, and I don't think they started it up again. But I bet you could go to the rental maybe and find some of them. But they're so old. They're probably fallen apart by now, unfortunately, because they're historical. Yes.
May I just comment on the rental center?
Please.
As a former high school director, when act plays, go to competitions, we would do some of these classical pieces, or not classical. Anyway, I'd be hard pressed in my little town of Boyceville, Wisconsin, to find costumes or to put them together.
I bet.
So then somehow I went up to Guthrie before the internet, and they would rent them to us for $50 a piece, and we could keep them as long as we wanted.
Wasn't that nice? Wasn't that nice?
So when I would take my students into this warehouse with all these costumes, and some were so bizarre. I mean,
Weren't they? Yeah, some of them were just nuts. Well,
anyway, not too religious, but that was a blessing.
wasn't that lovely? It's a real loss. Yes.
Speaking of rentals, I don't know if there are other teachers here, but if you know the Theater Development Fund, TDF in New York, that runs that TKTS ticket booth, the half-price ticket booth, well, they have a costume warehouse in Queens. Whenever a Broadway show closes, because Broadway shows aren't done by theaters, they're done by individual producers, they have no place to take those costumes. So they take them to TDF and they rent costumes out nationwide. They will ship them to your theater or your school. So if you're doing Les Mis, they have the costumes from years of Les Mis, and you can rent them for your, and they're pretty cheap too.
What a wonderful resource that is.
It's called the TDF Costume Collection.
Well, thanks for telling us about that. That's great.
There's also a local entity that has come about since the Guthrie stopped renting, that rents costumes for smaller theaters and high school productions as well. So there is a local company that has taken up some of the void that was created by the Guthrie closing.
Well, thanks for, you guys are full of information. I love it.
And then I'll just mention Halloween, we could still go to Guthrie Rental and get our costumes.
Aw, really? Aw, that's wonderful. Thanks for telling us that. This is Caesar here with the big sun on him, as if you didn't know this was Caesar, because got the big sun. Here's one of those Lupercal dancers. You can see they're in fur, and they've got kind of this Mayan, Aztec business on, so there was a big mixture of motifs in this play. Here's a homecoming. This was very 60s. It wasn't had any renderings at all, because these characters were down and outers, and they just went to stores and bought them clothes, and the clothes didn't fit real well because the characters did not fit into society very well. So that was a comment on them. You can see the set is leaning. Can you guys see that? And that is because the set also was out of kilter, because to show, that these characters are having a hard time here. Very 60s, very mini skirts. The beauty part, this play, was the costumes were slightly satirical. I think they're more than slightly this one. And The characters had names like Sir Epicure Mammon, and that would tell the designer, maybe give him some hints as to how to design these costumes. There was a lot of people in drag in these costumes, a lot of men in drag. Here's one right here. There were, the play was divided into colors. So one was pink, the scenes, pink, yellow, blue, and silver. There were mini skirts, there were high heels, and there were a lot of men in drag. Here's an artist right here in his smock, and this guy has an Aztec print coat that they bought at a store. So that is that for the beauty part. And this is Morning Becomes Electra. And this play was based on John Singer Sargent, the lean look, that sort of very New England, very austere type. Here's a Carl Eichstein was the designer, and this is one of his renderings. Here's another one of his renderings, and here's the costume from that rendering. And everything, you can see everything, the set was austere, everything was just sort of lean and based on John Singer Sargent. Uncle Vanya. This Uncle Vanya was the first time, this was another Chekhov play, so it was wools and tweeds and laces and chiffons. And this was the first time that the suits were all made at the Guthrie. They were able to get enough people to do tailoring, so they were able to make all the suits. And this play was set in 1899. This is the Venetian Twins, strictly set on the Commedia dell'arte. They had 3 harlequins, by the way. They had 3 harlequins, and they were supposed to be the same person, but this was a farce, so there were pratfalls and crazy colors swirling around and crazy action. And those harlequins were supposed to come in at different times and be the same harlequin. It was supposed to give you the illusion that it was the same person. These were the straight people in the play, and they had normal costumes on. And then these were the commedia people in the play. And you can see a mask right here, and here's the harlequin. And the director wanted the designer to make the fabric, to get fabric that was as close to the period as he could find. So that was that for that. This is Ceremonies in Dark Old Men. This was the most naturalistic play done at the Guthrie. It was a slice of Harlem life on the stage, and it was done by Geraldine Kane was the designer, and she bought everything. I don't think anything was made. And here's a picture of Ceremonies in Dark Old Men in the barbershop. So you can see it's kind of a different kind of different levels of society here. The Tempest, this is John Jensen, wonderful designer. He designed this Caliban character. I don't know if you guys know about the Tempest, but he designed this Caliban character to be super padded. Then he went to a rehearsal and saw Caliban right here crawling all over the floor, and he knew he couldn't keep that. So he had to get rid of a lot of that padding. Now, the characters that came into the island were all in a high Renaissance style. The characters that were on the island were based on Hieronymus Bosch. You guys know that painter? So that was that fantasy part there, but the characters that came onto the island, like I said, were in very heavy, very hunky type costumes. So there was a huge differentiation between those two. One very heavy, one very light, obviously. You can figure out what that means. This is Hieronymus Bosch right here, in case you guys don't know who that is. And A Man's a Man. This is a doughboy costumes that were made at the Guthrie. They were bleached. This is set in India in 1927. They were bleached. They were taken up on the roof. They were let the sun dry them. They were taken back downstairs and bleached, taken back up on the roof. And this was to give the feeling that the sun was bleaching these costumes, because they were all made fresh. So they had to distress them that way. This is Taming of the Shrew. This was a Desmond Healy. Desmond Healy was one of the most wonderful designers I've ever known. He liked to take costumes and make layers out of everything. He wanted things to have a soft look to it, not just one stark piece of fabric. He would layer sheer fabric over sheer fabric to give this kind of candlelight feel to it. This play was kind of a grab bag of costumes. It was different periods. you can see that Kate's costume here is a totally different period from this costume. So and this right here was a curtain he found at a theater in Washington, D.C., and he asked if he could have it, and they said yes, and he took it and made this coat out of it. So that was cool. Here's his rendering method, of course. He was the most wonderful person. Every time I'd see him after I interviewed him, he would run up to me and give me a hug, and he was just a great guy. Okay, this is a play by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. This was about prisoner of war camp. The designer went to visit a man in Milwaukee who was Estonian, who had been in a prisoner of war camp for 7 years. And he talked to him for 2 days. This was out in the world type of research. This is primary stuff. And he gave John Jensen one of his great coats, and he used that to design the rest of the coats in the play. Now, the prisoners were all in browns, the guards were all in silver and gray, so that was this color differentiation. At the end of the play, at the curtain call, the actors took parts of their costumes off and their wigs off, and it was just some kind of character statement. So here's Cyrano de Bergerac. This is all of that layering I'm talking about. This is Desmond Healy. So this is that lovely layering he does. He would paint, but he'd paint through lace to kind of fuzz the edges a little bit. He didn't want to paint so that it was real painterly looking. But here you can see all of you can see all of the layering he did here with different kinds of diaphanous and see-through fabric. This right here was called the baker's dress. She was in a bakery, and he made it out of this stuff called marquisette, and it's a shiny kind of taffeta fabric, and it was to look like a glazed donut. That's why. So I thought that was kind of cool. This is Miss Alliance. This is just straight, a 1910 upper middle class British family. Wasn't painted at all, very straightforward. But these costumes were made at the Guthrie, so that's good. Touch of the Poet was 1828, very straightforward. Jack Edwards told me a story about this. Do you know 1828s are Empire style, right? So the actress did not like that played the lead. She wanted her waist to be showing. So she was very angry about it, but he told her, no, you have to wear the period. Opening night, she comes out with a big belt on. He was so upset. He said he'll never forget it. It was such a shock to him. Couldn't fire her, I guess, so had to keep her. Diary of a Scoundrel is very straightforward. It was 1860s, 1870s, and this is another Desmond Healy play, and you can just see a little bit of layering here. This is a patchwork costume made for, I think she's a soothsayer, and this is a cotton robe that he made for Glafira. And this is Diary of a Scandal. This dress right here was called the lampshade dress for obvious reasons. And it was a fading beauty that was trying to keep up her beauty and her appearance. And this is not the rendering for this, but it's very close to it. It's the same play. This, Midsummer Night's Dream. Well, talk about nudity. I mean, there was a lot of nudity in this. And kind of Las Vegas style, really. It was okay, well received. There were some people who had a few things to say about it. Here is Theseus. You guys know this play. Here is Hippolyta. This is the Titania. And you can see the difference between this hard military look and this very soft diaphanous look of the fairies, of course. Here's the Fairy King, Oberon. The only costume he had on really was a posing strap. So it was pretty nude. Now, the fairies wore pearlized makeup to make them sheen, of course. And this costume right here, I have a picture of it. Here he is, right here in this costume. This fabric had plastic piping in it to give it that boing, 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 this big brown burn. And the non-fairy people were all dressed very courtly style, very Elizabethan. heavy. Here are the fairies crawling around without much on. And here's a fairy coat that I was able to photograph in natural light. It was diaphanous fabric that had been dyed a whole bunch of times to give it a rainbow effect. This is horsehair collar right here, and this is seam tape that has been dyed to be placed upon this costume. This was a fairy outfit, of course. Here's a mice and men. All these clothes were bought, except these clothes were made, her clothes were made. They were patched, and the big deal about these costumes is that they had to take the zippers out of the flies and make them into button zippers. So that, you might laugh, but that's a lot of work, so. And then they distressed the costumes, of course. These are very, very poor people, so this is, these costumes all needed to be, I mean, look at these overalls. They were so distressed, and probably cheese grater and all sorts of bleach was taken to them. And they bought them all in secondhand stores around the Twin Cities. Secondhand stores are very lucky to have theaters in their town, because I know I'm a costume designer and I've gone to a million secondhand stores to look for costumes. Okay, this is the relapse. Now look at this cartridge pleating right here. Big time cartridge pleating. This dress right here was an adult actress, but the character didn't want to grow up, so you can see her dress is kind of childish. This was a mourning costume, but it had a little bit of purple in it, because the real true, it was doubtful whether she was really attached to her mourning. So they had that little purple in there. And I don't know, do people notice all this? I hope so, because, you know, costume designers go to a lot of trouble to. And these costumes I was able to photograph in natural light, because they were part of those displays I was talking about. Look how beautiful that's made. Look at the panels right here that this is made out of, and just the piping. Do you see the piping that goes in here? These are extremely complicated costumes and just beautifully made. Italian straw hat. This was just a fanciful, just real colorful, realistic, if somewhat fantastic in decoration. The designer took all of the ridiculous features of the clothes of the era, and there were lots of ridiculous features, and incorporated them into his design to capture the flavor of farce. The show went over budget. I think it could have been because these poppies right here were made in New York and cost a ton of money. I don't know why they couldn't be made here, but they weren't. Here they are on this dress, and here is the dress right here. These strawberries, this is a wedding dress. This embroidery was put on, sewed on. It wasn't real embroidery. And these strawberries were stuffed and sewed on, of course. I mean, this was a fun show. It must have been fun. I don't know if anybody can see it, did they? Sure, it must have been fun to look at. Anyway, okay, you guys, this is the end, so hold your horses. This is, now this is kind of like House of Atreus. Heavy, heavy, heavy. Do you guys know the story of Oedipus? So what happens was this king had this baby, but the soothsayer said, that kid's going to grow up to kill you. So what the king did was he put the poor little baby on the side of a mountain so that he'd die, and tied his little ankles together. Oedipus means pierced ankles. So somebody took pity on him. The man who was supposed to put him on the side, like remember Snow White when they took pity on him and put him into a farmer's house, and he was raised in the country. But anyway, he started traveling when he was older, and he came to a town, the town he was born in, and there was a phoenix sitting, a kind of a devil character sitting outside the town that had tormented the town people, and said that I will not leave until someone can guess the riddle that I have. Well, Oedipus, of course, got the riddle, so he became king of the town. His father had died, and his mother was still kind of young, so this is kind of gross, but he married his mother. So he married his mother, Jocasta. Now, that's a very important part of this play, because when he finds out that he married her, he goes crazy. I mean, you know, of course, who would? This costume is his mother, Jocasta, and it was just cheesecloth that had been sewed and tucked and sewed and tucked. But can you imagine how hard that was to wear? But there you go, she wore it. Here's Jocasta's rendering. This is Desmond Healy, our wonderful Desmond Healy. This is Jocasta doing her thing, you know, being mournful, because of course she goes crazy too when she finds out she married her son. And these tabards were fur that was turned, fur was turned on the inside, leather patches were put on, and all these kind of hardware things were glued, hot melt glued onto it. I think that was heavy to wear, but you know what? Here they are. See these guys right here? They got all that. They got all those tabards on. But Desmond Healy's whole thing about this was, of course, no Greek robes, of course, no togas. He wanted a very, very primitive type of feel to this, and and of course, he took inspiration from Egyptian, African, Tibetan, Hebraic, and Cretan influences. So he had all that mixed up. He had even Japanese idioms in there, African idioms, and he wanted. I mean, this play was the way they acted it, from what I could read, was that it was a drum beat, you know, very primitive, very way back in the Dark Ages type of. Here's Oedipus. He's in sort of this is all braided furs and jerseys all braided together, painted with gold and glued, so it was very heavy. Here's the Creon costume, and here's the Oedipus robe detail. This is the robe, this is what he put on after. He, by the way, takes his brooch off of his costume and jams his eyes out when he, I know, well, it's theater, right? And of course, so he does this, and you know, the blood's coming down. It's fun from a makeup point of view to figure out how to get those eyeballs to bleed, right? Because it's so dramatic, of course, when the blood comes through. And then he puts on this robe because he's so tortured by what he's done. And this robe is all just very primitive, just furs, and look at all the strings hanging down. So that is a character statement, of course, because that shows what distress he's in, of course. And here's a Jocasta costume again, and I think it was just a perfect costume for her. It's that cheesecloth. It has a tiny bit of a toga feel to it, but you know, not much. And then this is this costume. Oh, don't point to it. This costume is China silk that has been wet and crumpled, and then sewed onto a China silk background. This is Tiresias. This is the guy that delivers the bad news to Oedipus and tells him that he's married his mother. So now, can you imagine when this character walked out on stage? Can you imagine the light hitting that thing and all the shadows it had on it? It must have been just a wonderful looking costume. But look how primitive it is. I mean, we're talking this barely recognizable as a costume. And then this is a Theban citizen. Now, if you think you want to sew costumes, just reconsider here, because this cheesecloth was dyed, and every one of these tucks was done by machine. So it was just brutal. And all of this jewelry here was thin aluminum that they'd cut out themselves and made jewelry out of it. And this right here is just a braided, cording, that sort of thing. But look how primitive this is, too. It's all very, very primitive. And must have been a wonderful show. I don't suppose anybody saw it, did they? Could give me a personal report? What, Stephen?
No, but a little trivia fact is Oedipus was played by Len Cariou,
Oh,
who was the original Sweeney and Sweeney Todd and plays Henry on Blue Bloods.
that is so good. Let's go back and look at him. Here he is, right here. So there you go. Thank you, Stephen, for that wonderful little tidbit. Okay, so now this is the end, everybody. So Christmas Carol wasn't a full-blown play. This was just scenes, and there were costumes made for it, but the director, David Feldshuh, he thought better of it, and he just had the actors go home and get stuff out of the closet and use it. I don't know what his thinking was, but because I think the costumes look great. But this is just scenes from Christmas Carol. The next year, 1973, it was a full-blown Christmas Carol. Has everybody been to Christmas Carol? Okay, so anyway, you guys, that's it. So thank you for your attention.
questions. I'm gonna get out of the way, but just wanted to say thanks for being here. Thanks members for being here. Thanks new members for joining. Yeah, and please consider becoming a member if you like programs like this. Please.
This is a great little museum, you guys, and it's full of Hennepin County history, of course. But anyway, any questions or, yeah, I mean, you need to go. Thank you for coming. It's really, really.